Well, welcome to another edition of Christian Answers. And today we are going to be talking about the topics that are under discussion today in Rome. If you've been following the news lately, you will realize that the Roman Catholic Church is participating in what is called a Synod on the Family at the Vatican today. And we are going to be talking about some of the topics they are talking about. Now, who is they? The bishops, many of the bishops from around the world, not all of the bishops, of course, but the bishops, many key bishops from all over the world are talking about family issues. Pope Francis, the current pope, he recently visited the United States. He spoke before Congress. He spoke to the president. He spoke before the United Nations. He attended a conference on the family in Philadelphia, and now he has convened another synod. This is the second synod in 2 years on the topic of the family. Now, the Roman Catholic Church is in a crisis right now for a number of different reasons. It isn't just centered on family issues, but many of the crises are dealing with issues related to the family. For example, right now, one of the big issues in the Roman Catholic Church is what to do with divorced and remarried Catholics. They are not allowed to currently take communion and be in full partnership and fellowship in the church as far as communion goes. And so the church is trying to figure out what to do with all of the many Catholics who are divorced and remarried. They want to try to include them more into the fellowship of the Catholic Church, but they don't want them to then, therefore, get the idea that divorce is acceptable, remarriage, easy divorce, easy remarriage. They want to also continue to teach what they teach. And that is a little bit different than what the Reformation churches teach. And we'll talk about that today. I want to talk about that issue, that specific issue that the synod priests and bishops are talking about this week and for the next couple weeks in Rome. We want to talk about the issue of divorce and remarriage. It is different. The Roman Catholic Church holds a very strict view of divorce and remarriage. In fact, it does not grant a divorce. It usually grants a annulment, and that is if there is something wrong with the process of the marriage or the marriage shouldn't have taken place supposedly in the first place, then it can possibly be annulled or wiped out as far as a legal structure. And now they're talking about what to do with all of the Catholics who are divorced and remarried. Will they become full members and full communion members of the church? In the Protestant church, it's not that way. There are a different view of divorce and remarriage, and there are different views within Protestantism. There isn't one single view, but there's a lot more leniency, there's a lot more tolerance, and it reflects more, I believe, the Bible's understanding of divorce and remarriage. The Bible is very limited in its teachings on divorce and remarriage, and we want to read one of the key passages in the Bible dealing with divorce and remarriage. It's Matthew 5, verse 31 and 32. And let me read that, and then we're going to talk a little bit about that in connection with this Synod on the Family that's taking place now in Rome. So it says here, it has been said, this is Jesus saying this, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, causes her to become an adulteress. And anyone who marries the divorced woman commits adultery. So in this one passage, Jesus is describing, on one hand, the state of divorce and remarriage in the Jewish world during his lifetime, and that was one of easy divorce and easy remarriage. The Pharisees, by this time, had structured a legal system that allowed for divorce and remarriage for almost any reason at all. And so it was very loose, it was very casual, and Jesus wanted to correct that situation. Now he says to them, he says that it wasn't that way from the beginning. In another passage, he talks about from the beginning, God created them male and female. And he created one man and he created one woman. And so he did not create all of these different arrangements that we see today. He created Adam and he created Eve and he brought them together for marriage. And they constituted a married couple. And now we see all kinds of aberrations. We see all kinds of deviations off that. But it was not that way from the beginning. And now the Pharisees came to Jesus in another passage and they said, well, Moses permitted divorce. Moses allowed for it in the law, and that is exactly true. If you look in the Old Testament writings, you will find that Moses had allowed for divorce and remarriage in the Old Testament. And so we read in, for example, Matthew 19. It says that when Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went into the region of Judea to the other side of Jordan. Large crowds followed him, and he healed them. Some Pharisees, again, there's that group, the Pharisees, some Pharisees came to him to test him. And they asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and he said to them, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate. Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? And Jesus replied, verse 8, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that everyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness and marries another woman commits adultery. So there you have the standard. That is the will of God for marriage. The will of God for marriage is one man, one woman for an entire lifetime. No divorce, no separation, no remarriage. That is the gold standard for marriage, and that is the way God created it from the very beginning. Now, when you see the Roman Catholic teachings on divorce and remarriage, and you see their view on marriage, you will find that it is basically repeating the gold standard that God outlines in the Old Testament, and then Jesus repeats in the New Testament. The standard of one woman, one man, married for one lifetime, that is marriage, according to God's will. Now here, Jesus does give an exception of what happens in the hardness of man's heart. And so we see that there is provision for divorce. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what those provisions are in our next episode of Christian Answers, so you don't want to go away. We'll be back just shortly. Well, welcome back to our episode of Christian Answers, and we're talking about the subject that Rome and the Catholic Church is talking about in the Synod of the Family right now. And we're going to use this opportunity to do a little teaching on the subject of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. So we see here, we just got done looking at Matthew 19, where Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and saying the gold standard, the will of God for marriage is one man, one woman for an entire lifetime. Now, the Pharisees brought up the fact that Moses in the Old Testament law had a provision for divorce. And there's no question about that. There was a provision for divorce, but Jesus said very clearly to them it was because of man's hardness of heart that there was a provision for divorce, because it is not God's will that any marriage should end in divorce. Now, when we go back to Matthew 5, we see the provision for divorce that Jesus talks about here. He says in Matthew 5, verse 31 that I read before, "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce." We just read the passage in Matthew 19 where Jesus talked about that, and the Pharisees brought that up, that certificate of divorce issue. And then Jesus says, "But I tell you that everyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness causes her to become an adulteress. And anyone who marries the divorced woman commits adultery." So we see from the beginning that God did not intend for there to ever be divorce. But because of the hardness of man's heart, men and women's hearts, there is divorce that is permitted. But divorce that is permitted for one reason, and that is because of marital unfaithfulness, or you might call it adultery. It is called adultery. It's when the marriage covenant has been broken. Now, in the Old Testament, if you remember, what the consequence for breaking the marriage covenant, what is the consequence of committing adultery? It is death to the person who commits adultery. So in the Old Testament law, there is a provision for divorce. But there is also a provision, and it is a stated law for adultery, that the person who has committed adultery must die. And this is something that was carried out in the Old Testament. And it's interesting that there was a recent movie, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago, and it was another Moses movie. Hollywood loves to create Moses movies, Exodus movies, Exodus stories. They love to go over and over the story of Moses, which is great because everyone gives us a little bit of a different angle on what might have been happening back there when Moses led the Jews out of Egypt into the Promised Land. But not the latest Moses movie, but about 5 or 6 years ago, they actually showed a situation in the Old Testament where a woman committed adultery, and she and her sinful partner were stoned to death by the Jews in the wilderness as they wandered around for 40 years and 4 decades out in the wilderness. And so it happened. The Jews did stone people for adultery. Now, what would happen with the other person in the marriage, the innocent partner? They would therefore be eligible for remarriage because the marriage had been broken, the covenant had been broken, and their spouse is no longer alive because of the adultery rule that says they should be stoned. And when they were stoned, then that freed the woman up to be remarried, or it freed the man up to be remarried, whichever one was the innocent party. Well, today, in the New Testament, by the time of Jesus, we see that the Jews were not stoning people in any kind of regular way, in any kind of consistent way. And that was one of the problems back at the time of Jesus. There was adultery that was occurring, and it was known about, but the penalty was not placed on the guilty party consistently. So you see instances, for example, in the New Testament where the Pharisees brought a woman to Jesus who had been committing adultery, but then you have to ask yourself, well, if she was caught in the very act of adultery, where is the man who was committing adultery with her? Where is he? Where was he there to be stoned also? So they just brought the woman. Why not bring the man also? See, it wasn't applied consistently. And we see also that by the time of Jesus, that penalty was relaxed. And so usually it was the case that even adultery was not capital punishment by that time. So God, in his providence and in his mercy, had sort of given grace given mercy to even sinful adulterers and did not exact the penalty. We saw that also in the case of David, King David. He committed adultery with Bathsheba, but then again, he was not required to pay with his life. Well, a strict understanding of the law of Moses would have said David the king deserved to die, and he did deserve to die according to the law, but he was not made to die by even God himself. And so that we see some grace, we see some mercy, we see God lessening that penalty. And so by the time of the New Testament, stoning for adultery, capital punishment for adultery was not widespread. And so what that meant was then you did have a person who was innocent in the marriage partnership who therefore was divorced from her or her husband, and she was therefore permitted to remarry. Why was she permitted to remarry? Because of the grace of God in allowing her guilty marriage partner to live. Under normal, strict interpretations of the Old Testament law, that partner would have been dead, and therefore the innocent partner would have been free to remarry. Well, because of God's grace and mercy on the guilty, sinful, adulterous partner, then there is also mercy and grace for the innocent partner, and the law that might have permitted her or him, whichever was innocent, from remarrying was also suspended. So you see God having mercy on one, and then he has having mercy on the other one and permitting the remarriage. Now, what does it mean for there to be a remarriage? The Jewish people did recognize a right to remarriage, and they did not see that as living in a state of adultery. Now, the Roman Catholic Church is holding tight and holding firm to the gold standard in the Bible, the original intent of God, and saying that anyone who is divorced and then remarries while their spouse is alive is committing adultery, living in a state of adultery. And that is part of the conundrum and the controversy right now at the Synod of the Family in Rome, as these Roman Catholic bishops, including the Pope, try to come up with a workable plan that would somehow allow divorced and remarried Catholics to enter into the full communion of the Church. Now, traditionalists, of course, are saying, no, that's not right. We've never done it that way. And that's true. They haven't done it that way. It is a tradition in the Roman Catholic Church that it's not done that way. But then there are other people who are saying, well, it's about time that we begin to rethink this because of the situation that we're in with the society as it is now. We want to bring people into the grace and mercy of God, and we need to re-examine our strictness on this issue. Now, the Protestant churches have generally been more lenient and more tolerant of divorce and remarriage. They have not held to the strict gold standard that God says only one man, only one woman for a lifetime, and if there is a divorce, then the person who is divorced cannot get remarried as long as their spouse is alive. The Protestants have not seen that interpretation, have not followed that interpretation generally, although there are some that do that. And so we have to say that there is a difference here between Protestantism and Catholicism. Now, which one is more accurate according to the Bible? Well, I'm going to talk about that in the final segment of our Christian Answers program, so you don't want to go away. We'll be back in just a minute. Well, welcome to another segment of Christian Answers, and we are talking about the topic of what is being discussed in Rome right now. The Roman Catholic bishops, including the Pope, are discussing issues concerning the family, specifically the issue of divorced and remarried Roman Catholics. Should they go back to communion, be permitted to go back to communion? We talked about God's original standard was that there was one man, one woman, one lifetime, no divorce, no provision for divorce. Then in the Old Testament, Moses and the law of God in the first 5 books of the Bible permitted divorce because of the sinfulness of the human heart. And so he permitted divorce, And evidently also he permitted remarriage also. Now, we're talking about the verse in Matthew 5 where it says in verse 31, Jesus says to these Pharisees, "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, causes her to become an adulteress, and anyone who is married, the divorced woman, commits adultery." Now, I want to explain a little bit what this verse is saying. Jesus is giving an exception to the gold standard of marriage, and that is, the gold standard is one man, one woman, one lifetime, no divorce, no provisions for divorce. You stay together all your life. Now he's allowing divorce in an exception case, and it says, "But I tell you, anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness causes her to become an adulteress." So there is an exception. If the marriage covenant is broken, divorce may take place. And then it says, "But I tell you, anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness causes her to become an adulteress." So what that's meaning is, if a man divorces his wife, it is assumed, it is presumed that she will, in fact, need to remarry. She will need to have a husband to take care of her, to protect her. She will need a man, so she will have to get married. And then when she gets married, if it's not on the case of marital unfaithfulness, her divorce took place, she will have been involved in adultery when she remarries. But he says, Jesus says, if it's a case of where the marriage bond has been broken due to unfaithfulness, she is permitted to marry and not be labeled an adulteress. And it also, the other clause, it says, "And anyone who marries the divorced woman," and we'll add that exception, "except for the marital unfaithfulness, commits adultery." Again, so anyone who marries a woman who has been divorced, except in the case of marital unfaithfulness, commits adultery with her. In other words, if a man marries the woman who is divorced, and the divorce was not because the marriage bond was broken in the original marriage, then that man is committing adultery with that woman who is also committing adultery. So the exception clause is that if the marriage covenant has been broken through unfaithfulness, the marriage has been broken. And if the marriage has been broken, then remarriage is acceptable. Now, why could that be justified? Well, if you think back in the Old Testament, if one of the partners commits adultery, that person was required to die, capital punishment for adultery. And so then the other person in the marriage would then not have a living spouse, and then that person would then be able to remarry without committing adultery. And as I explained before, God, in his mercy and forgiveness, has loosened up that regulation. He does not require that everyone die who commits adultery. And so because he forgives and he permits or tolerates an adulterer to not die, capital punishment, he then also, we would assume, would allow that other person in the marriage partner who was injured to then remarry and not be living in adultery because of the remarriage. And so that is the way that many Protestants see this passage, is that it allows not only a case justification for divorce, but we also would presume that it allows justification for remarriage. If you're going to allow the justification for divorce because the marriage was broken, the bond, the covenant was broken through adultery, if the marriage is shattered, if the marriage is broken, then you would presume that you would also allow for the remarriage of the people in which the marriage covenant, the first one, was broken. And so that's what Protestants have generally understood this verse to mean. Now, the problem with that is it isn't entirely clear that we can validly presume that remarriage right is given, even though the right to divorce is given here. We are assuming that if the Lord gives an exception to the gold standard of marriage, which is one man, one woman, one lifetime, you stay married, you don't get divorced. If he allows for the exception of divorce because of marital unfaithfulness, which he does, we aren't entirely sure that he allows for the remarriage of the parties involved, but we assume that he does. So if you are wondering, does the Protestant church permit divorce and remarriage? Well, yes, most Protestants permit the divorce according to this exception clause that Jesus gives because of adultery. And we also assume that that would mean the right to remarry. But we're not 100% sure, so that leaves a little bit of ambiguity. The Roman Catholic Church says, no, we do not allow for any kind of remarriage. And they are taking the golden standard of marriage and applying it universally and strictly. Now, according to most Protestants, their reading of the Bible, we would say that there is a right to remarriage, but we're not guaranteeing it 100%. So people who do get into a second marriage, people who do remarry, they can feel fairly certain that if their original marriage was the result of adultery, then their original marriage covenant was broken, and they are allowed to get a divorce by the grace and mercy of God. And they also have some reason to assume and presume that God would allow them also to remarry, but they don't have 100% certainty of that because the Scripture is not 100% certain, and there are many Protestants who do not believe that the right of remarriage is being given here, even though it seems like a logical conclusion based on Jesus giving a right to divorce because of adultery. It would seem that he would also be giving the right to remarry because the original marriage partnership was broken through adultery. So, but we are not 100% sure. So if you are going to marry a second time, and if you are going to enter into a second covenant before God, you have to be aware that you are assuming that God is going to allow this and does permit that. But we do not have a 100% guaranteed promise in the Scripture that he does. So you have to enter into this very deliberately, and you have to enter into this very seriously, and you have to look and pray, and you have to ask God to guide and direct you, because this is not something that is totally clear from the Scripture. You are taking the risk, you are taking a chance that this is not 100% kosher, but we also see from this passage that it seems like a logical implication of what Jesus is saying here about divorce. So that is a less than ideal answer, but that is actually the way it is, and we have to live with that ambiguity. So I hope that that has helped you, clarified things for you. This is a serious issue. Divorce is serious. Remarriage is even serious, and we need to be very careful, and we need to be very cautious about these things when we depart from God's perfect will, which is one man, one woman, one lifetime. Well, I hope that's helped you, and we'll see you back here again next week on Christian Answers.